aqui escrito o que aconteceu ou... Talvez.
Para liberar o computador. Eles estavam esperando algum moderator. O seu microfone já está ligado?
Está ligado.
Está logado como você aqui.
Yeah, we're not able to share the screen.
There we go.
Rejoining. Ah, okay.
Eles não tinham liberado.
Recording in progress.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, right on time. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the March meeting satellite session on complex systems. This meeting is organized by ICTP South American. This session is organized by ICTP South American Institute for Fundamental Research. My name is Danilo Liarte, and I will be chairing this session. And if the remote participants can ask questions by submitting questions via the chat on YouTube. Our first speaker today is Professor Marcos Aguiar from Campinas State University, and he's going to talk about generalized frustration in multidimensional Kuramoto models.
Okay, thank you, Danilo. It's a great pleasure to be here. The title is a bit complicated. I will explain it in details as we go along. So I think most of you have seen pictures like this, showing a big flock of birds that behaves as if they were a single animal flying in the sky. Well, this type of pattern that you see in space, it also happens in the time domain. So if your system has, if the particles of your system are oscillators, and these oscillators synchronize their phases, the system also behaves as a single big oscillator pulsing together. Here, the classic example are fireflies that in some situations can start flashing together, but there are many other examples like, let me see if I can point, yeah, pacemaker cells in the heart, power grids, groups of neurons in the brain. And in order to motivate the work I'm going to present here, I selected one particular example that is nice and illustrates the kind of complexity that you can find in these systems. So this is an experiment with sperm. Sperm, when they swim, they move their heads up and down. So this motion of the head works as an oscillator. And what these people did was to place these sperms on a thin two-dimensional layer of water. And as they swim, they tend to form these small vortices where the sperm, they swim together. So this is a sort of flocking. And as they swim, they move their heads in synchrony. And moreover, if you look at the big picture, you see that these little vortices, they form a global pattern in space which has this sort of hexagonal shape. And there is more. People found recently that inside each of these sperms, if you look at the tails, there are some special cells called motor cells. And these cells, in turn, have to synchronize in order for the tail to swing properly. So you have several levels of synchronization and interactions between them. And if you want to model or describe this type of complexity, we need to first to couple spatial and internal degrees of freedom. This is the theory of swarmolators, which is the topic of the next talk. But you also need models that include more internal degrees of freedom that can be coupled in a more generalized way. So this is my talk. It's the multidimensional Kuramoto model. That's what I want to talk about. So to start, I want to very briefly to remind you of the Kuramoto model for those of you who are not familiar. So the Kuramoto model is a model of synchronization. You have n oscillators. Each oscillator has a single phase, a single degree of freedom, and it oscillates with a certain frequency, omega I, and they're all coupled together with the same coupling constant for all pairs of oscillators. So there's a nice way to represent the entire system, which is to place the oscillators on a unit circle. So the position of each oscillator is its phase. And you see from this diagram that as you increase the coupling constant, there is a tendency of the oscillators to synchronize. And you also see that there is a nice way to measure the degree of synchronization, which is to calculate the center of mass of the system. So if the oscillators are uniformly distributed, the center of mass is close to the origin. But as they synchronize, the center of mass moves towards the unit circle. So the size of this vector of the center of mass is a good order parameter to measure synchronization. One more information that I'd like to stress here is that once the oscillators synchronize, they rotate together. The speed of rotation is exactly the average of the natural frequencies. And so if you choose this average to be 0, the cluster of oscillators just stop at some point. Where it stops, it depends on the initial conditions. Okay, so if you simulate the system, you see that, so we calculate the order parameters as a function of the coupling. You see that at the beginning, you don't see much synchronization, and then it starts to increase. And so this suggests a phase transition. And indeed, Kuramoto showed that in the limit of infinitely many oscillators, this is a phase transition. He calculated the critical coupling constant, the shape of the curve, and so on. So what I want to do is to generalize this model to include more degrees of freedom per oscillator, and also generalize the coupling between them. No, I don't want a single coupling constant to rule the entire system. So, so there's a trick to do that. That's not my work yet. But if you go back to this representation, and instead of representing each oscillator by the phase phi, you can represent it by a unit vector, which is just cosine phi, sine phi. And because you know the equation of motion for phi, you can derive the equation of motion for the vector. And when you do that, this is what you get. So this is the equation. This tells you how this vector rotates on the unit circle. This W is a matrix containing the natural frequency. And this is completely equivalent to the Kuramoto model. It's just a different way to represent it. So, so this idea was put forward by Ott and collaborators a few years ago. And what they realized is that once you have this equation, you can interpret the sigma not as a vector on the plane, but for instance, as a vector on the sphere. It's a unit vector. So as long as this W matrix is antisymmetric, you can think of this equation as representing unit vectors in any number of dimensions. So for instance, in 3 dimensions, you would have 2 angles, theta and phi, so you have more degrees of freedom implicit here. And what they found, which is interesting, is that if you do this calculation in 3 dimensions, that phase transition that was continuous, it becomes discontinuous. So there is a sudden jump, and the system synchronizes for any positive coupling. It starts at 1/2 and then increases as you go on. So okay, so now I finally get to my work. So what we did is that we wanted this model to be more general. And since we are writing everything in terms of vectors, why keep the coupling constant a scalar? So the natural operator on vectors are matrices. And we realized that if we promote the coupling constant to a matrix and put it exactly here, acting on the sigma j's on the sum, you preserve all properties of the system. This vector, this field of velocities remains tangent to the sphere for any dimension, so particles on the sphere won't leave the sphere. And just so to give you an idea what this coupling matrix would do, if you take a very simple example of a rotation matrix as coupling, and so this is still in 2 dimensions, let's keep it simple for now. And if you work your way back and write the equations in terms of phases, what you get is the Kuramoto-Sakaguchi model. So what you are doing is that you are rotating every vector by the same angle alpha, and that's what you see here. Phi j gets displaced by alpha. So if K is a general matrix, things are more complicated. So we write the general case like this, the rotation plus a symmetric matrix. And if you write this back in terms of your equation for the angles, so you get this extra term here. So what do you get from this model? So this is the phase diagram, and you get new states. So let me explain to you what this is. So this is JK plane. So J and K are these amplitudes here, and you also have these two angles, alpha and beta. Alpha is the slope of these straight lines that you see here. So what you see in this diagram is that in this region here, the oscillators synchronize, but they don't synchronize anywhere. They synchronize in a specific direction that is the direction of the largest eigenvector of the coupling matrix. So if you change this matrix, you can control where your system goes. Here, along this line, you can show that the two eigenvalues of the coupling matrix are the same, so the matrix is proportional to the identity, so this is the Kuramoto model. Here at j equals 0, you have this Kuramoto-Sakaguchi model. There is no j, only k and alpha. And in between, you have a new type of state, which is these oscillatory states here that we call active states. So here, the cluster of oscillators, they rotate, and while they rotate, they contract and expand, so the order parameter oscillates like this. Let me see how much time I have. Oops. Okay. In more dimensions, you can also do some calculations. For instance, you can get exact results in any number of dimensions for identical oscillators. If you forget about the W matrix, which has the natural frequencies, then the equations get simplified, and you can show these two results. So if the dominant eigenvalue of the coupling matrix K is real, then the equilibrium solution is to place all your oscillators in that direction. So that's the stable solution. On the other hand, if the dominant eigenvalue of K is complex, then if you use this eigenvector, you can split it into real and imaginary part. You can do the same with the eigenvalue. And then the oscillators, they go into a stable periodic trajectory in the plane. So you have this multidimensional sphere. You get a plane defined by V1 and V2. Your oscillators oscillate in this plane where these constants can be calculated, and essentially the period of the oscillation is the imaginary part of the eigenvalue. When you put back the frequencies, things get more complicated. You have to do numerical calculations. This is what we did recently. And just a quick example here in 3 dimensions. So we have to come up with a coupling matrix. So we decide to use a very simple coupling matrix so we know what's going on. So this is the antisymmetric matrix with the natural frequencies. So what we did here was to sample the natural frequencies from a Gaussian distribution centered on omega 0 with a certain width delta. And from this matrix, you see that it's a rotation here and a scalar here. So if B is very large, the dominant eigenvalue is real. If A is large, the dominant eigenvalue is complex. So that's what you see. So when the dominant eigenvalue is complex, you see these rotations when delta and omega are very small. But as you increase delta and omega, you get active states, you get static states. And similarly, when the dominant eigenvalue is real, it starts static, you go into a rotation, goes back to static. So you get a very rich phase diagram. The same can be done in more dimensions. So we did experiments in 4 dimensions as well. Then things are a bit more slow to calculate, but it works basically the same way. You can get these phase diagrams and they look complicated. This is all numerical. We don't have these curves analytically. So as applications of this theory, Guilherme, who is giving a talk this afternoon, is doing modular networks where each of these modules has a different coupling matrix, and we see how they interact. Each coupling matrix can represent a different function of the module. So for instance, one of the modules can rotate, the other can be placed in one direction, and so on. And so next steps here is to couple this model with spatial variables, for instance, do swarmulators, especially with those active states. Add 3 and 4 body interactions, which is something we are doing right now, and study in more detail these modular networks. So I think that's it. I can stop here and get some questions if you.
I have a quick question for you. You had that phase in your phase diagram where the synchronization happened at one particular direction that was given by the eigenvector corresponding to the largest eigenvalue or something like that. Can the eigenvalue be degenerate, and what happens then? Yeah,
when the eigenvalue is degenerated, so the matrix is proportional to the identity. You go back to the original model.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's that line. It's one of these. It's here. So along these lines, the eigenvalues are degenerated.
Oh, okay, okay.
And then you don't know where to stop, so you recover the original Kuramoto model.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Very nice talk. I want to ask you, you mentioned these rotating modes that appear. Do they appear before the synchronization, after the synchronization? When do they appear?
I don't know. We looked at the solution after synchronization, and the oscillation was there.
Yeah.
So, but for instance, if you take just the Sakaguchi model, then the oscillators, they also rotate. But the modules of the order parameter is constant. So they are rotating, but they are not spreading. In this active solution, as they rotate, they spread and contract. So the module of the order parameter oscillates like that.
I'm saying this, I will mention in my talk something like that, but before I mention something that I won't talk about. So I mean, using the O'Keefe model and things like that for the swarmulators, in a multiplex, we found that just before the synchronization happens, there are rotating modes all over. And then I will talk about that because then in the single...
And then the rotations, they die after
and
they
then it dies.
synchronize.
And the rotation, as a matter of fact, the thing that happens in the multiplexes, what we saw, and that's why we found it, was because sometimes, in some cases, we saw that the energy of the system before going into the synchronized state will fall. And then we were asking, why is that happening? And then by analyzing everything, we found that the system starts rotating before that. Yeah. So, and that makes somehow the energy low.
Yeah, I can take a look at that, at the transient. Yeah, that would be, okay.
We have Paulo?
Do you think it would be useful to do a field theory? Because you have a microscopic description, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
there are ways to, they call dimensional reduction. So there are tricks where you can replace all these infinite oscillators by sort of mean field equations. Yeah, but they work well only if the distribution of these natural frequencies is a Lorentzian. Then there is an integral that shows up that you can then do by residues.
Otherwise, you cannot do the cost graining.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, let's thank Marcos again. Now I invite Professor Hilda Cerdeira from São Paulo State University.
No, yo prefiero ese porque voy por ahí con ese. No, aquel es mejor. Eso como fácil. Así. Y este no bolso. Posso pôr diretamente no bolso. Espera que abro porque una de esas no preciso. Espera, me da un segundo, por favor. PowerPoint aquí. ¿Y dónde está? ¿Dónde está última? Aquí.
Okay, Professor Hilda is going to talk about phase transitions in swarmolators, the XY model, and other things. Thank you, Hilda.
Para avanzar. Okay, thanks, Danilo. Thank you very much for the invitation to Danilo and Pablo. So, I will try to explain something of what we have done. So, first, let me show you my collaborators. My collaborators are Steve Cogni, Wenceslav Meli, Thierry Njogo, Patrick Lodo, and Robert Ching and Hilaire Fotzal from Cameroon, and Fernando Ferreira from Brazil. So, as Marcus already said, swarmolators is, what we are going to study is sets, the collective motion of some, let's say, animals, can be starlings, can be fish, can be drones. And you may have seen many of them. locusts, if you live in the countryside, you may have seen them. So then, some of the most beautiful pictures are like the one in the center, which have made some people, mostly in Italy, very famous with those pictures. And so then, what is a swarmolator? A swarmolator is essentially when we look at this kind of systems and we consider that there is some sort of an interaction between, let's say, the spatial movement of these systems and there something internal that how we are going to describe is that, and then somehow they may be coupled or not in some cases. So this is the kind of system we are going to find. And then what we're going to, all this started with some work by Tamas Vukcek at the beginning of this century, and really end of the last one. And then followed by people like Diaz-Gilera and other people. And then, but one of the most interesting models probably is that of Kevin O'Keefe and collaborators. And this is the model that we are going to use, the model of O'Keefe. And the model of O'Keefe, here. X corresponds to the spatial variable, theta corresponds to the internal oscillators, and we consider that they somehow interact between themselves, and so we see that this variable theta is related to the variable x through this term, and the spatial variables somehow interact through the oscillators, where the oscillators essentially are described by a Kuramoto model, the one that Marcus made clear for us today, and essentially the coupling constant is depends on the external variables. The thing is, since we are representing physical objects, they cannot occupy the same space. Therefore, there is no problem with this term x minus xi, which cannot be 0. And therefore, in space, these systems never synchronize. So when we talk about synchronization, it may be that they move together. Yes, but they are not occupying the same place in space. So essentially, we usually talk about synchronization in the theta space in most cases. So VI is the velocity of the spatial velocity, and omega I is the frequency of the oscillators. So we are going to take omega I and VI constant, and we are going to take them equal to 0 for a while, so without any loss of generality. So we go to the next slide. So now we are going to study the effect of that these two distributions, the spatial and the internal, tend to affect themselves. So, and then we are going to analyze the transition to synchronization. So, but before that, let me tell you this part, which is essentially work of O'Keefe et al. The thing that we see is by modifying the parameters K and J that we had before, we can see that these systems have different states or different phases. So, and what they found are essentially 5, which are the first one is a static asynchronous, static asynchronous, and here we represent the spatial variables, and we represent them in the angles in the XY space, and sorry, I never said, we consider the system to be bidimensional, and here in blue we have the angles, the thetas. So the correspondence between for instance, the A corresponds to the spatial case, while F is its corresponding state for the variable theta. So then the states that they found was static asynchronous, something that they call an active phase wave in which they all move, essentially. The static phase wave, that is, they have a phase wave because they are separated. The colors in this case correspond to the values of the corresponding theta. So it means that all those in this triangle have the same values of theta. So, and this is a static case also, and this is called a splinter phase wave or clustered, as you prefer. So, and finally, a static synchronous in which all the theta variables, all internal phases are equal. So, this is from, as I said, from the work of O'Keefe et al. So, the variables that we use to represent our systems as is the order parameter, essentially are two. There are three, but I don't mind. One is the order parameter of the theta variables, that is the internal phases. Another one, which is represented in this all the figures in blue. And another one is S, which is essentially the correlation between the internal phase and the external phase. That is the arctangent of y divided by x. So, then, as you can see, here we are representing one of those cases, I don't remember which, in which we have the variable are 0 and essentially 1 when you have complete synchronization. Asynchronous here, complete synchronization there, and S is essentially, it has some value near correlated cases in the case that psi and theta are correlated, and it goes near 0 when we have complete synchronization. So essentially, this is the case of a splinter phase. So this third variable I'm not going to talk about. So let's go to the next slide. So then the point is, what I want to say is to show you something something different from what only 5. So I'll try. Something different is that before the synchronization happened, in which we had what people like O'Keefe had seen, that they had essentially a splinter case going into complete synchronization. What we found is that this, going before complete synchronization, there is a rotating wave on the theta variable. And that happens to go into another state, which we have called static weak phase, before going into complete synchronization. So let me go to the phase transitions, which is what I wanted to talk about. So if we go near the synchronization transition, then at the synchronization transitions, xi minus xj is always a constant. Therefore, since that is always a constant, we can write the Hamiltonian of the system as, for the theta variable, as this equation that we have here. But this equation is nothing but an XY model, okay? And so one of the things that we see, and when we did that, was because we were worried to see what happened when the system has reached the synchronized state. And what we found is that the synchronized state, the system lowers its energy all the time. But then, when we saw this equation, we were worried, because after all, this equation is in one dimension. And then all memories were telling us that in one dimension, there is no first-order phase transition. And that people had been talking about first-order phase transition there. So then we started looking around in the literature. And lo and behold, we found something, some interesting things. So let me see if we, so the first thing that, not the first, but we found it, so just putting them in order, is one of the things that we found is a paper by Cuesta and Sanchez in 2004, in which they discussed precisely the theorem of Van Hove. Is it always valid? That's the point. Did they find if it was always valid? Because in the system of O'Keefe et al., we do have a hardcore potential. That is one of the things that Van Hove was asking for. And so essentially, there shouldn't be a first-order phase transition, okay? So then we found this paper by Cuesta and Sanchez, in which they doubt that the result of Van Hove is so general as they say. So that's one of the things that they argue. Then we also found for this problem that the Passot one is, according to Passot, the Kuramoto model has a first-order phase transition at infinite if we, in the thermodynamic limit, provided the natural frequencies are evenly spaced or uniformly distributed in a finite range. Then there is a paper quite well quoted by Gomez Gardeñas and others, which have shown that there is an explosive transition in a scale-free network of Kuramoto oscillators when the natural frequency and the degree of the node are equal. Okay? This is hard to see, but again, that's what they say. Then there is a paper by Scardal and others who essentially are saying that Gomez-Cardeña's results are okay, and they are much better if you have noise. Then there is a Leiva paper which have extended these results, but what they ask for is that the natural frequencies cannot be equal between themselves or to the mean. This is hard to have in the case of the Kuramoto models, as shown by Gomez-Cardeñas, that they have an explosive synchronization. Because if you have a very large system, to have that the frequency, and on top of that, if the frequency is connected to the degree of the node, it's hard that the frequencies are not going to be equal. 1 second only. I'll stop. I won't talk about the Hong and Martins, but then I will show that what we did was to start seeing this problem and start putting noise in the frequencies. And what we saw, we looked at 3 cases, and in the 3 cases that we saw that the system, this is one of them, this is the second, and this is the second, and here are the figures that you're talking about, we can discuss later. And this is the 3rd case, and what we saw is that the transition to synchronization is not first order. Okay, how strong? None, I cannot guarantee, but it's not first order. It's not first order. I know also, and I'll finish there, that I know also that there are discussions, although I haven't seen any paper, but I've talked to people in conferences, there are people discussing whether or not an explosive synchronization and the first order phase transition are equivalent. Okay, so then let me conclude by just saying thank you very much for your patience and all that. Okay.
Questions for you,
Yes.
Max?
So what is exactly the statement about the distribution of natural frequencies?
The statement, initially ours were all 0. And then we have 3 cases in which in one of them we have constant and half constant or 0, and the other half with a small noise. I can't remember exactly how they are, but I can pass them on to you. But the point is, in all the cases in which we put something different from 0 in the natural frequencies, that would be more similar to the one done by people who claim that it's a first order, we have seen that they are not. So that's the point. So I have not seen any work in which you could say that their answers are general or cover all the possible cases. So.
Yeah, okay, yeah. That's just to connect to what I showed
Should
before.
I put them back?
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
In 3 dimensions,
yes.
then apparently you have a truly first order transition.
In 3D?
Yeah,
that would be great.
Yeah.
That will be great to see.
Yeah,
so
in fact,
for the Kuramoto.
Yeah.
There is the one that is passed because we didn't have enough time. There is a paper by Hongs and Martins in which they analyze the Kuramoto models. They analyze the Kuramoto models with noise and without noise. They do quite an exhaustive work, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, on the interest of time, let's move on, and thank you again.
It's all right.
And our next speaker is Dr. Pablo de Castro.
Después tiro eso. ¿No posso robar? Não preciso comprar, não. Eu gosto de ficar na cárcel. Ai, quantos outros tem? Que mais tem? Mira, que encima tenho óculos. Espera que tire os óculos. E encima tenho aparelho de ouvir. Que mais? Se o meu cai, você devolve. Tá bom.
Segurando esse, ficou ali por trás. Tem um problema de topologia aqui, né?
Você precisa de pular?
Se quiser.
Você sabe, né? Acho melhor coisa. And Pablo is going to talk about random searches with chemotaxis, optimal strategy transitions induced by target scent. Thank you, Pablo.
Hi, thank you, Danilo. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. So I'm going to talk about random searches, as Danilo mentioned. This is a work in progress with Ricardo Martinez Garcia, which I think you guys know from ICTP here a couple of years ago. So we know that self-propelled organisms, they can move and they can interact in various ways, okay? And this can generate a myriad of emergent complex behaviors. And just to give you a brief overview of my research on the statistical physics of moving organisms, we ask questions about these from two perspectives, which are active matter, which is a field of non-equilibrium statistical physics, where we are interested in how systems composed of many self-propelled units organize in space and time, and spatial ecology, where we ask how individuals organize in space and time while interacting ecologically. So there is a difference in scales and questions here, okay? So a few topics that we are interested in are motility-induced agglomeration in bacterial mixtures, epidemic spread between agglomerates of organisms, critical habitats in situations of deforestation, diffusion of marine bacteria, which are ultra-anomalous in a sense, the role of environmental interactions in optimal foraging, which is the topic today, a bit different from the rest, which are collective dynamics, and population dynamics near toxic sources, okay? So today, we are going to talk about random searches, and we know that this is a topic that arises in many different areas, for instance, for individuals searching for food, or when we are searching for something after a disaster, or when we are searching for our keys at home. Also, during the war, the theory of random search got a lot of new ideas because they were trying to use these for finding warfare items in the vast ocean. Imagine trying to find a bomb in the ocean. And also, if you have a protein trying to bind to a specific site of the DNA, which is a long chain, this is also a problem of random search. Okay, so random search is a problem that arises in many different areas. Okay, so about animal foraging, which is the main topic today. If we look at the trajectories of the, for instance, albatrosses, you're going to see this kind of behavior, okay? So you have these things, which are rectilinear displacements, separated by changes of directions, okay? And if you plot the distribution of lengths, you get more or less a power law with distribution, which is the Levy distribution, and the exponent is 2, okay? And this exponent equals to 2 actually appears for different species, in many different species. If you change a little bit the environment, it might be the case that this exponent undergoes a transition, and it's no longer 2, it goes to 3.5, for instance, if you increase the amount of food. And this is related to what we are going to discuss today. But in general, in most cases, it will be 2, okay? So the difference, so the Levy-Walker model is basically random directions. You choose a direction at random, and then you have a displacement sampled from a power law distribution, okay? And if you compare Brownian walk versus Levy flights, or Levy walks, the distinction is not important here today. you're going to see that within the same time window, the Levy flight or Levy walker will undergo, it will get much farther from the original point. Okay, so it can explore longer distances. So this is the distribution that we have, as I mentioned, is just power law truncated between a minimum and a maximum move length. Okay? Okay, so by changing one parameter, which is the exponent of this distribution, you can actually change the balance between intensive versus extensive searches. So you can have a little bit of small steps, and then you have a jump or not, and the balance is controlled between by these mu. Okay? So let's put this into a model, a foraging model, for instance, of near versus far targets. We have, in one dimension, a target at position 0. It could be a food that we want to find. Okay? And then another target at position lambda, and the animal is at position x0, and it has a radius of vision, in such a way that if the target is within that radius of vision, we say that the item has been found. Okay? And of course, the animal does not know where the targets are, and we start the Levy walk, and then when it finds, we take note of how many steps, or the travel distance, summing up all the steps, and we do this multiple times. Actually, we can interpret that we have a distribution of periodically positioned items, and every time that the animal finds the target, it will be replaced at a distance x0 from the original, from the found item, and it will restart the game again, okay? And if we do this is what we get. This is the average travel distance between targets, okay? And this is the parameter mu, the type of movement parameter. And what we see is that there is a minimum here, okay? So there is an optimal movement strategy. And by movement strategy, I mean the mu, okay? And the presence of this minimum can be explained as follows. If we have a very large mu, we are actually giving preference to small steps. And then, of course, the individual will be changing directions all the time, and it will get stuck in between the two targets, okay? It will never find a target. If mu is very small, then we give preference to long steps, and then it is guaranteed that we are going to find a target, but at the cost of a long walk, for instance. It will find the far target. Okay? So there is a sweet spot in between these two things. Okay? And this is consistent with empirical data. So you have mu equals 2 in the data, which suggests that there is an evolutionary explanation for minimizing this distance. I can skip this. So our idea here is basically to ask, what happens if there is some sort of signal coming from the targets that we can use to bias our search, okay? So for instance, the targets, you can smell the targets, okay? So let's assume that there are signal cues or molecules that are emitted at some constant rate, gamma emission, at the target. They decay at constant rate, gamma decay, everywhere in space, and they diffuse through space with a constant d, diffusion constant d, okay? If you put these in a diffusion equation and take the solution, it will look like this. It's basically an exponential. We can make the gammas equal to 1, and then we have this formula here. And when we plot, it looks like this. If we increase this lambda s, which is controlled by the diffusion, we have this red curve, which, as you can see, the peak is smaller because you are diffusing much more rapidly the molecules produced there. But at the same time, it will reach farther in distance, okay? So we are going to see what is the difference between these two scenarios. So how we implement these into our model? Basically, instead of having 50 and 50% to choose our direction of motion, we actually now are going to consider the gradient of this concentration of molecules. And why the gradient? Because this is what animals can sense. They cannot sense the absolute amount of molecules, but rather the gradient of this concentration, okay? And there is a sensitivity alpha to this gradient. So we consider both gradients from the left and the right targets. Of course, for alpha equals 0, we return to the previous case, okay? And this is the results that we get. Let me walk you through this. For small lambda s, nothing changes because the signal is too localized. Okay, so nothing changes, basically. You still have a global minimum here, as you can see. As we increase lambda s, then the smell becomes far spreading, and the individual can use that to bias its movement. And what we see is that eventually, by increasing lambda s, the global minimum becomes a local minimum. And now the global minimum is at mu equals infinity. So the optimal strategy now to reduce the travel distance is to be Brownian, because mu equals infinity is now Brownian. It's no longer a Levy walk. And if we keep increasing lambda s, eventually we go back to the previous situation. Okay? So the idea here is that we have two transitions in optimal search strategy. Okay? So for small lambda s is as before. For intermediate lambda s is Brownian, mu optimal equals infinity. And then for large lambda s, once again, it is as before. I'm going to explain this a little bit better in the last slide. Another thing that is interesting here is that you have a local minimum. And when you have a local minimum in this energy landscape, let's call it like this, you can start to think about metastable situations. Okay? So imagine that you are in a scenario where the movement strategy, mu, changes, is not fixed. So it's slowly and stochastically adjusting in time. It could be through evolution or through adjustment of other adaptation, for instance. And if this is the case, one may get stuck in a local energy minimum for long times. Okay? So the individual is actually not in an optimal state. Okay, so the preliminary conclusions of this work in progress, as I mentioned, is that in random searches, target signal information can induce transitions in optimal movement strategy. For targets producing molecules whose concentration decays exponentially in space, we find three scenarios. For short spread length, the signal is too localized, so the optimal strategy is the old one. For intermediate spread length, we have a Brownian dynamics as optimal strategy, because otherwise the searcher misses the signal. So if you take long steps, you take the risk of going too far from the signal, and of course you are not going to be able to use the signal anymore. So the best strategy is to take small steps to stay around the signal, and once you pick up the signal, you can go much faster to the target. Okay? And for large spread length, the signal reaches far, but the signal becomes too flat. Okay, so the gradient is almost zero. So you can no longer, once again, use the signal. And the model predicts a metastable equilibrium in evolutionary or adaptive dynamics. And in general, our results can help explain why animals have different movement patterns depending on species, environment, and season. Season is quite important here because, as we have seen, lambda s is controlled by the diffusion of the molecules, and the diffusion through Einstein's relation is temperature, is proportional to temperature. So if you change the temperature, you are going to change the effective lambda s. Okay? So before I finish, I just would like to advertise this school and workshop on active meta here at ICTP in early October, if you know anyone interested. And here are the collaborators and funding, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. I have one quick question for you.
Yeah.
In the one-dimensional model, as you decrease mu, you're favoring large steps, right?
Yes.
So you always hit the target, as you said, right?
Yes.
But if you move to 2 dimensions, for instance, you don't have this guarantee anymore. And how does this strategy works in this case?
Yeah, this will depend on the distribution of targets. But if you have a more or less homogeneous, randomly homogeneous distribution of targets, eventually you will hit a target. It could not be in the first layer of targets, right? But eventually, if you take a very, very large step, you will reach the target. What people have seen comparing the one-dimensional dynamics and the two-dimensional dynamics in other problems of foraging is that usually things just get rescaled, but the physics is still the same.
More questions for Pablo? Okay, so let's Thank Pablo again.
Acho que sim. Tá.
Eu acho que não está.
Pode. Não, não é no ouvido, não. Não.
Pronto?
Deixa eu
Ok.
ver se esse ponteiro funciona. Como é que o ponteiro funciona?
Aqui,
Ah, aqui. Ah, tá ok. Aqui.
em cima, e aí do lado passa os slides.
Ah, tá. Mas aqui em cima é o ponteiro. Não, mas eu não estou vendo o ponteiro. Ah, tá. Tá ok.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Silvio Salinas from the University of São Paulo, and he's going to talk about modulated structures in a nematic model with chiral interactions. Thank you, Salinas.
Okay, due to very short time that I have, maybe it's better if I explain the model I'm using. Okay, I use this to begin this kind of talk with a quotation from the famous book by Dejean and Proust in this area. The statistical mechanics of fluid is difficult, the statistical mechanics of nematics is still worse. Even for the simplest models, no exact solution has been worked out. So this is the usual excuse for playing around with very elementary models. And just I wrote here some of papers, past papers, and there's this final, there is a paper here with Danilo, who is here. It's a paper published more than 10 years ago, but maybe it was the first paper I used this kind of formalism. Okay, so let me tell you what I'm doing. So on top there, it's the famous Myers-Alp model, okay, written in. Looks like the statistical mechanics model looks like the Heisenberg model, except that the spin variables are quadrupoles indeed. So this is a way of writing the theory of Myers-Alp, and here I wrote a fully connected model. So it's the mean-field version of the Myers-Alp model, okay? And in this case of the Myers-Alp model, here are the quadrupoles, and the quadrupoles are written in terms of the directors of the nematic units. So the directors are unit vectors pointing in different directions. And what I wish to calculate the partition function here is the canonical partition function for the fully connected model, okay? And with nearest neighbor interactions on a Let's without this full connected version, this is known in the literature as the Lebbevold-Lasher model. It's not very much well known, but it's really a model which is one of those few statistical mechanics models we know. Okay, here is the discrete version of the Myers-Alp model, which we used to call Myers-Alp-Zwanzig model. That's the name we did use in the beginning, okay? So instead of using directors which are vectors, three-dimensional vectors, we just use three directors. Excuse me, it's just we use directors which are vectors along the Cartesian axis, x, y, and z. And just three vectors, because direction doesn't matter in this case. So we really have three three nematic states. And the nematic states are here, are written here, 3 quadrupole states. This is what we call the MS-Z3 model. Of course, we can do calculations for this MS-Z3 model. So here is the phase diagram with the first order transition, which is a transition characteristic of the characteristic nematic transition of liquid crystals. We can do an expansion, okay? Then we can make contact with the phenomenological Landau-Degen expansion for these systems. We can really calculate the coefficients of the expansions in terms of the parameters of the model. That's what we do. There is a famous cubic invariant, which is responsible for the first order transition. And we can use the calculations on the bit lattice. Calculations on the bit lattice, here is one of my students, which they say it looks like a pair approximation, which we go a little bit beyond the mean field approximation to see whether the main features of the model of the transition is still there, and they are still there. That's something we do. Well, that's a 3-state model. But there are biaxial nematic structures as well. So besides the uniaxial nematic structures, there are biaxial nematic structures. This is an old problem. These biaxial structures have been characterized experimentally in thermotropic liquid crystals in the last 10 years, or maybe less. But they were almost well known in lyotropic, micellar-like fluids. And this is an old problem in São Paulo in the context of lyotropic micellar-like fluids. I have a long interaction with experimental people in São Paulo. And it's interesting to construct a generic form of a Myers-Alpin model. This is done by this more complicated Hamiltonian, which involves the interaction between S and S prime, but also involves the interaction of the introduction of a new quadrupolar biaxial structure. Okay, so this is the complete Hamiltonian that we have, and this Hamiltonian was proposed initially by Straley in a famous paper in 1974, but there is a more recent work by Sonnet, Virga, and Burin, and we call this the SVD model. Then we tried to look at this model, more complicated model. It's here, okay? It has 3 parameters. It is a parameter of there is a temperature parameter, which is not interesting, of course, but there is a gamma parameter and a lambda parameter, 3 additional parameters to take care of all possible symmetries which may lead to a biaxial nematic structure besides the usual nematic structure. Though I'm not going to pay attention. The S and B are more complicated quadrupole elements. Those quadrupole elements are very interesting because they have zero trace, etc., etc. But I can do the same as I did before. I can use just discrete nematic directors. If I use discrete nematic directors, in this case, the minimum model is a model of 6 states. It's a model of 6 states. So this is the more complete Hamiltonian. Of course, I can look at several possibilities. The possibility of gamma and lambda equals 0. This is the usual uniaxial case, the usual Myers-Alpin model. There is another possibility with lambda equals gamma squared. It's incredible. This is the most studied nematic model in the literature, okay? Almost everybody studies this nematic model, and everybody says that this corresponds to London forces, etc., etc., etc. Well, that's a possibility, but this is not the only possibility. Of course, it's called the geometric mean because it becomes very easy to group those elements in terms of a square of a sum and do all the calculations. But we can look at several other possibilities. It's a very interesting case. is a case with gamma equals 0. There is no coupling between uniaxial and biaxial elements. This has been studied by different people, including my student Francisco, who is here, who claims that has very interesting phase diagrams, which I don't know whether they are really seen experimentally, but they are there, okay, no doubt, okay, it was interesting to look at them, okay. Okay, let me go ahead. Here is the six-state model, one of the six-state models. You know, we just introduced the parameter delta to take into account those 6 states, and then we can study several very interesting cases with disorder, dilute the system, if the disorder is quenched, if the disorder is dilute. This is an important question in this area, in my opinion. Disorder in those fluids is a thermalized disorder. It's not like in solids, but you know, we can make many calculations. So, and this is the model according to the geometric mean approximation. According to the geometric mean approximation, we have an interesting phase diagram with the temperature in one of the axes. Here is the parameter delta. And this is the typical phase diagram of biaxial nematic systems. This is the first proposal of phase diagram for binomials. This was made by Fraser in the 70s. Okay, you have an isotropic phase. We have a nematic phase. We have another type of nematic phase. People say this is one phase is a disk-like phase, the other phase is a plate, cylinder-like phase, and then we have a biaxial phase. And the biaxial phase ends at a critical point, which is called in the literature the Landau multi-critical point. So it belongs to this phenomenology of multi-critical points, the Landau multi-critical point. These lines of transitions are first-order lines. You have to be careful because some of my slides I changed the conventions. But anyway, here is the first-order line, and the transition between the nematic phase and the biaxial phase is a second-order line. Disagrees with thermodynamics. It is really all right. Okay? But we're going to have more surprising cases. This is a quite surprising case. This is a case with a combination of gamma and lambda slightly different. And then we have here a very interesting case. It's a case where there is a triple point. It's a triple point. And then there is a tricritical point. First-order lines and second-order lines. This is something that we found also. And then this is the responsible is there. Okay, right? So this is a case of no couplings between the uniaxial and the biaxial elements, and then we have second-order transitions, complicated structures, etc., etc. I don't have any time to go in details of these phase diagrams, which are phase diagrams who come from the full coupling, the complete connections between these, but also come from the bit pairs and the pair approximation calculations. All right, so let me try to tell you something about the real new things that I have to say. Our work today, how to deal with cholesteric structures. Is there an elementary Lattice model that accounts for a phase diagram of cholesteric phase structure? Can we gauge the dependence of the cholesteric pitch on temperature? And here I have drawn some figures of cholesteric pictures. Besides the nematic uniaxial or biaxial structures, which are more controlled structures, there are cholesteric structures. And then comes the modulated structures. So we go back to the Myers-Alp model, and we can write the simple Myers-Alp model, as I have written here in this up part, as a cosine square plus a constant. But anyway, it's simple to show that the cosine square, theta I and theta j, are the angles of the directors at I and j. And what I can do, okay, in a planar version, this is just a planar model, as the models that we have seen some of those models today. They are planar models, but of nematic character, due to the square. From the magnetic point of view, there would be no. If you allow just a restricted number of p directions, we have we have a nematic analog of the p-state clock model. The p-state clock model has been studied a lot in the literature. We consider a nematic analog of a chiral p-state clock model. What we do is exactly that. We consider just a chiral interaction, and so we have an analog of the p-state clock model. It's hard to explain this here, but as in the Dzieloszynski-Moria interactions of magnetism, we consider a rotation about a certain axis. Today there is a poster of William, who works with me, and we did a calculation like this in magnetism. And for an exactly solvable model of magnetism, which is the spherical model, it's there, okay, it's there. We really characterize the structure. We construct a special spherical model of the Moria interactions. That's exactly what we do here. No? We do this rotation. Well, this transparency is not interesting, but we really take the interaction between a certain quadrupole and the quadrupole with rotation of an angle delta. So if delta is pi over 2 and it is magnetism, that's exactly the Dzieloszynski-Moria interaction. Dzieloszynski-Moria interaction, people usually write in terms of a vector product. There is a competition between a scalar and a vector product in the Heisenberg model, for example. Here we go a little bit beyond. We write just an angle, which is not pi over 2. It's just an angle. Then we have a long experience on this. I'm not going to talk about this, but we hope to find these incredible modulated phases that we find in the Eisen model with competing interactions. We do this, and this is the kind of phase diagram that we find. This is a published work a few years ago with Eduardo Nascimento and Roberto Petri from Rome, and where we did the phase. We were able to construct the phase diagram for a model, but a two-dimensional model in the XY plane, and then we have a nematic structure. We have a structure which is periodic, 3 up and 3 down, something like this, but we have a very complicated collection of modulated structures which are hard to understand, which depend on this angle delta. Delta is here in terms of 3 delta over pi. And here is something that we plan to do, and there is a huge number of intermediate commensurate phases between the usual nematic phase, which is there, and the phase 1/3. So we were able to map all those steps, and we have been able to show that these steps define what is known in the literature as a devil's staircase. It's there, okay? So this is the work that we have done. We work in progress is to do this, but not in 3-dimensional, not with symmetry O2, but in symmetry O3, and do it in the complete symmetry O3. And this is the work of my student, William, who is here. And my student, William, he has already obtained a phase diagram, which is still not very beautiful, but it's the maximum we have, okay? With a disordered phase, which is there, an ordered phase, which is the nematic phase, in the modulated region, which has to be very well explained, okay? It's a lot of numerical work to figure out what's going on. Okay, thank you very much. That's the work we are doing, okay? Thank you.
Questions for Salinas? I have a comment, perhaps. You mentioned this model for the miles-up model with chiral interactions, and you have some cosine square of theta I minus theta j minus some angle or something like that.
All right.
And I remember from Marcos Aguiar's talk that there was also one of the choices for your matrix K would lead to a Kuramoto model with a cosine of theta I minus theta j minus a phase or something like that. I'm just wondering whether there will be some sort of a chiral model analog in Marcos. Anyway, just to a curiosity.
I have to learn the Kuramoto model. There are points of intersect, points of contact, okay? But the Kuramoto model is closer to the magnetic models. It's not really nematic from what I have seen here, okay? The square in the cosine defines the nematic, that both directions are, all right? So this makes a lot of difference, okay? It's the same difference as the usual Ising model and the Potts model of three states. The transition becomes first order, and there are many differences, okay? But there are, of course, many points of contact. I have to learn the Kuramoto model.
I just want to make a comment. Because it called my attention during your explanations, and now when you made the connection with Marcus, it's also, you also fall into Josephson junctions. You see, into the Hamiltonian
That's true, that's true.
And this reminds me much of the Shapiro steps.
That's true.
So you see, this is the interesting thing, is that you eventually, from one go to the other, and all of them have the same physics behind.
See, I have the impression that those chiral models, the chiral clock model of P states was very popular some, I don't know, 20 years ago. I don't know. At the same time, I was looking at the NE model, the Ising model of competing interactions along a certain direction. This is a very hot subject at the time. So many people looked at this model, but they forgot about the nematic counterparts. My only contribution is to revive the nematic counterparts, which are more difficult, unfortunately. It's not so simple as I supposed before, okay? Right. So that's it. I'm looking at the nematic counterparts of those models.
Okay, let's thank Silvio again.
Okay.
Isso aqui. Como que funciona? Para frente, para frente. Onde que é o laser? Aqui na parte vermelha. Aqui.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Alexandre Martinez from USP, Ribeirão Preto, and he's going to talk about solutions of simple systems of the deformed quantum mechanics based on a new extended uncertainty principle. Thank you, Alexandre.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm very honored to be with such speakers that we have listened to. And I'm gonna, by simple systems, I mean wells and barriers, okay? And deformed will be, the Hilbert space will be deformed. And we are going to start very simple with grade school operations and mathematics. So I'll skip this. I want to recall what the exponential function is. So if we have a symmetric hyperbola around the 45 angle, the area underneath the plot is given by the logarithm function, and the exponential function is its inverse, and it's given by this value in the x-axis. Okay? If we crook this hyperbola, no, okay, so the exponential function has some properties. It's positive, it's monotonous increasing, it's 1 for 0 if x is 0, and we can map the whole space from minus infinity to the positive axis, to positive values. So another special property of the exponential function, it is the eigenfunction of the usual derivative operator, okay? So it's own function. I see here I have the problem with the slide, but you can imagine if I crook the hyperbola around the bisectress, and if I look at the surface underneath, it can be smaller or greater than the exponential, so smaller or greater than the hyperbola, and then what happens is that the inverse of the surface, it's the generalized exponential function, and we can have things like that. We lose one property, it can vanish, and it can vanish for a finite value of x. My fingers are large and I can point. So it can vanish for large values, for finite values of x, and it can diverge for finite values of x and can vanish otherwise. And you can have the other situation where it vanishes below a critical value and it can work as another parameter. I have used some system, this equation, and it works very well for if one thinks of another parameter. So our study is to assign values here in the region that this generalized exponential function vanishes. And what does it imply? Okay? Here we have a problem because since we have a vanishing region, we cannot invert this function to the logarithm. We have the same values everywhere, so no inversion is allowed for the whole domain. Okay? And we want to try to fix it. Okay? And so we will allow this function to have values that's analytic continuation whenever it's real, or to give complex values to this region. Of course, when we do that, we lose some properties of the exponential function, and then, for instance, it's no longer monotonous increasing function, and we can have complex values. So we have to have in mind that the argument is real, but the value is complex, okay? May be complex whenever it was 0 in the previous case. And we have the definition is like this. We define a function that we cannot call exponential no longer because we lost the properties, most of the properties of the exponential function. For instance, we have case, it can be negative, or case where we have an inflection point, or case that's positive, but it's not, we have two values, okay? It's a U shape. So, and even case where we only have the imaginary values. This function has an application that we have published recently, and we can write roots of the polynomial equations in terms of this function and address complex values, okay, in these roots. And what we asked for is, what are the operator, the differential operator, which these functions we defined is the eigenfunction. So this is the question. And this question was posed previously. So for the generalized exponential of Tsales, we have this operator, this deformed operator, and Tsales function is the eigenfunction of it. We have another modification that vanished. This is by Trung, that even in this case we have a vanishing region, and our proposal is to consider this other operator. And when we do that, I want you to pay attention to this symbol here, because it means that you have the modulus of 1 plus lambda x, okay? So this modulus is essentially the Jacobian of a variable transformation, okay? And this operator has very nice properties, and we can do calculations with it because of these properties, and it works almost as the usual differential operator, okay? Also, we have integral operator with nice properties. By nice properties, I mean we can work as usual of these integrals, and we have linearity, okay? Like in these cases here. So that we can look for integral transforms. So an integral transform is the Fourier transform, and it has been generalized to consider Q-Gaussians. That's the generalization of the Gaussian using the exponential of Tsales. Okay? So this Umarov transform transform a Q-Gaussian in another Q-Gaussian. Okay? But it's not inversible. It's a problem, and it's not linear. What we have done is to propose another integral transformation. In fact, all started with this integral transformation we proposed. So it's to generalize the exponential in another subtle way is to put the imaginary part as an exponent. And the major difference between the other studies is that we put the Jacobian here. It means the modulus 1 plus lambda x. So if we do that, we are able to do the integrations in the complex plane, and we can show that it's a linear transform. It's the transform is linear and invertible. This is a complicated way to write this transformation, and the motivation was of defining the exponential function. The other way around is to write it simply as a Fourier generalization for this integral transform, and it has an inversion, and also it has a nice property that it preserves Parseval theorem. It means in one variable you have a large distribution. In the conjugate variable you have a narrow one, okay? and vice versa. So this is the uncertainty principle. So extended uncertainty principle can be generalized, and it has been in this way by Borges, where we have the Salles exponentials. It has been in this way by Chung, where we have the definition of the exponential by Chung, and we can generalize using the modulus. If we generalize this uncertainty principle using the modulus, we have an equation for the deformed Hilbert space like this one, okay? Where here, I recall this the wave function, which is a probability amplitude, and it must be complex, a complex function. So, if we write this equation, that's complicated because there's a derivative, first derivative here. In terms of our operator, we have this equation, which is very simple. It's the Schrödinger equations for barriers or for wells, depending on this sign, plus or minus here. The solution of this equation is also very simple. There are generalized trigonometric functions, kind of cosine, kind of sine functions, okay? So we can define functions that are compatible, that are the solutions of this equation using the operators. Borges has done that, but the generalization of Borges is not good for this quantum mechanical interpretation because it is real valid and does not maintain the fundamental relations of trigonometric functions. On the other hand, Chung's generalization brings back these properties, but they are limited in some regions. It does not work for the Rho space, and they are real functions. They are not probabilistic amplitude. Okay, so using our integral transform and our definition of the generalized exponential, we can write cosine and sine functions as log periodic functions of the tilde exponential, okay? And as I mentioned, it keeps the fundamental properties of both hyperbolic or circular functions, and it has the shape like this that works for wells, and the shape like this, log periodic functions that works for barriers. And of course, this work is in progress, and I would like to conclude that we have the actors, we have the character of the actors. We can put them together, but I don't know what physical problem this equation solves. So it's kind of a Pirandello play. You know, you have the actors, you have the characters, but you don't have their story. So it's missing their story. And I hope next time I can bring you a story with quantum optics or something like that. Okay, thank you very much.
Questions for Alexandre?
To start my question, I'm going to mention I think it was in the late 80s or beginning of the 90s in Physics Today, there was an article by Leo Kavanaugh. And the article was about fractals, a solution in search of a problem. So, that is more or less the same. Now, I want to ask about something. I can't remember the name because I don't use them. I mean, but you maybe may know more than me. That people nowadays write differential equations on non-integer spaces and things like that, and they transform like that. So what I want to know is this falling into the same kind of thing? So I'm trying to just put it
yeah. In fact, I don't know. In fact, I don't know. We are not alone. There's Ernesto Borges working on that, and Chung in Korea working on that. We are trying to work, looking for a physical system then that can be represented by that deformed Hilbert space. The derivative is not on time, but in position. So we cannot associate with dissipation or generation of something. So we don't have, at least I don't have enough knowledge to see what physical system has a deformed Hamiltonian that has a derivative with respect to position. And this is, but the function has nice properties. This is the fact. And I think to solve polynomial equation is one of that. We can write the solutions simply using these functions. That is not exponential any longer because it lost all the characteristics.
More questions? If not, let's thank Alexandre again.
Okay. Thank you.
Isso aqui vai no...
Okay, the last speaker of this session is Professor Maurice de Koning from Campinas State University, and he's going to talk about phase transitions involving superionic ice 18.
Exactly right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit in terms of topics. So like the title says, I'm going to talk about something that's called superionic ice 18. And specifically, I'm going to talk about phase transitions in this system. Well, you know, I'm talking about ice, so it's probably reasonable to assume that we're talking about water, which in fact is the case. And we are not talking about the kind of water we're used to, right? So we're talking about superionic phases. So to begin with, so what is that? Why is it not going? Ah, there it is. So what is superionic water ice? I think it should go back one. Yeah. So it is, these are phases which are not found on Earth anywhere. So they're phases which exist only under conditions of very high temperature and high pressure. the interesting thing is that in these phases, there are no water molecules anymore. So you basically have oxygen ions and protons. Okay. Now, this ice suggests it's a solid. In fact, it is a crystalline solid, but it's kind of different from the kind of thing that we're used to. So here I'm actually showing ice 18. The number is in the community is always assumed whenever there is a new phase. Today, I think we have 20 already. Okay. So this is a phase in which the oxygen ions occupy a lattice. So the red spheres are oxygen ions. And the protons behave as a liquid. So they're basically flowing through the system. So you can see a few of these protons were colored blue just to show that they're diffusing through the system here. Okay? And this was recently discovered, experimentally actually, in 2019. And this is kind of a new state of matter, right? This is kind of an inverse metal, because now you have negative ions sitting on a lattice, and we've got the protons flowing through. In a metal, it's the opposite, right? So we've got positive ions, we've got the electrons flowing through this. Okay, so so what kind of conditions are we talking about? So high temperature and high pressure. So this is a phase diagram from this paper from Yellow Nature 2019. So this is actually the work in which they discovered this phase or detected it. So so the pressure we are measuring in 300 gigapascals, and temperature goes up all the way to 8,000 Kelvin. So obviously these are not things you will routinely find in your lab. And so why would we be interested in these things? Well, first of all, it's water. So water is interesting just for the sake of itself, right? But there is actually also interest from behavior of planets. Specifically within our own solar system, we've got these two planets, Neptune, Uranus, in which it is believed that these kind of phases actually occupy a large amount of the interiors, and the flow of the protons may actually do stuff to, say, magnetic fields. Because these two planets have strange magnetic fields. They're non-polar, for instance, and very asymmetric. And even you can see that the center is shifted with respect to the rotation center. So that's another reason why people are interested in these systems. Okay, so in this particular study that we're working on, we're interested in just in the phase behavior, so something very basic. So in this case, we're actually trying to look at different kinds of phases. So one is an insulating phase meaning the protons are localized. So just as if they're molecules, they're not really molecules, but they're localized, right? Then we have the superionic ices. This ice 18 is an example of that. And if you go to higher temperature, you have a conducting fluid. So everything is basically flowing like a liquid, right? So this is what we're interested in. And so how do you actually go about investigating this, right? So, well, experiments, as you can imagine, are relatively hard to do. At temperature of 4,000 K and 300 gigapascals are not conditions you routinely achieve in a lab, right? So one of the things that people typically do is, okay, let's do atomistic modeling. So I'm going to have a model that describes interactions, and I'm going to use basically computational statistical mechanics, right? So how do you go about the description of the interaction between the particles? You could go to DFT, but that's extremely expensive. Also, semi-empirical models, something like Leonard-Jones or these kinds of models that people develop for water, well, they do not work for anything that's super ionic, right? So what we do here is we use DFT to build a catalog of configurations, and we use a neural network representation to adjust the data to this neural network, and then use the neural network as a description of our interatomic interactions. So that's what we do. this is actually something we already did very recently. So we use this neural network representation of DFT. And in this particular case, we're using the model that we developed to describe mechanical properties of two phases, high pressure phases. So ICE 18, which is the superionic phase, and ICE 10, which is an isolating phase in which the oxygen sit on a BCC lattice, okay? And what we would do is we would impose different states of deformation, mechanical deformation, and use the neural network to represent that, right? And then once we got this model, we basically run MD simulations using the LAMMPS package. Now, notice we are not putting anything of the liquid in this model. So the only thing we're doing is we take these phases and we deform them, and that's all. Okay, so let's go to the first transition. So I'm interested initially in the melting transition. So I start off somewhere here. So we're looking at 340 gigapascals. I start off at a temperature of 5,500 and basically heat up, and eventually I expect to find a melting transition to go for the liquid. So you go from this crystalline structure here to a fully liquid structure. Right? Now, to characterize this, we basically want to know the thermodynamic conditions for coexistence of the two. So what we need to do is we need to compute Gibbs free energies of both phases as a function of temperature for a given pressure. That will give me the coexistence temperature. So this is a plot of that. I'm not going to go into the details of these calculations, which are relatively involved. But what I'm plotting here is, this is temperature, and this is Gibbs free energy per H2O unit. And so the red curve is ICE 18, and the blue curve is the superionic liquid. So basically where they cross, that's going to be the melting temperature for this system at the pressure of 340 gigapascals. Now, something that's very interesting here is the slope of this curve will give you the entropy. And the difference in slope between the two gives you the latent heat. This is first order transition, right? Now, you can see that the slope, the difference of the slope is very small, which is curious because when you go from a solid to a liquid or crystal to a liquid, you expect a relatively large change in the entropy, the liquid, of course, having a larger entropy. In this case, the difference is very small, and actually we've shown that the deviations of the oxygen ions from the lattice are very large, unusually large. Even though they still vibrate around a fixed lattice position, the vibration amplitude is very large. So the entropy contribution of that is still very large. So much so that it's only 1 kb per H2O unit different. Okay, so now let's see where this thing fits in the phase diagram. All right, so this white band here is what comes from the experiments from 2019. So they're estimates, okay? So this is the point that we got from our calculations, which is pretty good, actually. And it's surprisingly good because we did not put anything of the liquid in the model. Okay, so this will give me 1 point, but I would like to, can we do something about the melting line, right? So I could repeat this same procedure for different pressures, but what we do in this case, we just integrate the Clausius-Clapeyron equation on the fly. So I start off with a given point, and I basically, in one simulation, we can actually map out the coexistence curve. So if you do that, that's what we get. So we actually did it in two directions. The blue line is what we get from our neural network model. So this is the neural network melting line for this model, which is surprisingly good, I would say. Okay, so this is the one for the melting transition. Now let's go to the other one, which is when I'm going into lower temperatures and I'm starting off with superionic ice and I'm cooling it down. Okay, so this dashed line is the superionic boundary estimated from some DFT calculations done previously. Okay, so the plot on the right it shows you energy as a function of temperature. So we start off here at 2700 K. the blue line, we basically cool down, so we're in 18, and then all of a sudden, boom, it drops to ice 10, right? We cool it down further, and we go back up, back again. So a very nice hysteresis loop here. So what's going on, actually? So let's see if this movie is playing. So we're basically showing this, the section in which we cool. So we were in the FCC phase, and then it just goes to the BCC phase. Now note, the blue protons no longer diffuse, so they're actually localized. So this is this BCC, this is the insulating phase. Okay, so these are basically showing the two subcomponents separately. So this is, the greens are the oxygens, green is FCC. When it goes to blue, it becomes BCC, right? And these, the white protons in the beginning, and you see immediately there's order, and it goes to an FCC. All right, so again, we do the free energy calculations. This is the ice 10, which is the BCC with localized protons. This is ice 18. We compute this coexistence temperature at 1993 K. If you look at in this hysteresis loop, it's nicely in the middle where it should be, of course, right? And of course, we can do the same thing that we did with a liquid. So we can basically map out the coexistence curve. And again, it's surprisingly, the agreement is surprisingly good. Okay, just very quickly on the mechanism. So this hysteresis loop basically shows you there's a limit to metastability, right? So what exactly is going on here? What's the mechanism behind this? So in this case, I'm actually taking a snapshot of the system right here and separating plots from the protons as well as the oxygens. So on the right, you can see the large majority of the oxygens is still in the FCC phase. But there's definitely crystalline order already in the protons. So what's going on in this case is the protons order, and once they do, the system goes to the BCC. So that's, of course, that's not how it happens in reality. You will always have nucleation and growth. But since we're in a small system and short times, you will never see that on simulation timescales, right? What about the other one? So the transition when you go up from ice 10 to ice 18. Now, this is actually something that was already known. So in this case, we have a phonon instability. So once you go from ice 10 to ice 18, what you can do in this case, this phase is actually stable up to 0K. So what I can do is just compute a photon spectrum as a function of, say, volume, right? So this is a phonon dispersion curves here for a given lattice parameter. So as you expand, you can see that once you get to a lattice parameter of around 2.41, you basically hit a point within the Brillouin zone where the frequency becomes 0 or would become imaginary, right? So this is a phonon instability that triggers this transition in this case. Of course, this is not how it happens in reality. It will always be nucleation and growth. All right, so that's basically what I had for you today. So the melting transition, so the ice 10 or ice 18 is very strongly anharmonic, which is very interesting. Also something, I actually didn't say that, but the solid-solid transition is actually a mixture of two types of transition, because you have a martensitic transition, which is diffusionless, like you see in iron, FCC, BCC, for instance. And at the same time, you got a diffusive one, because you go from a fluid proton system to a crystalline proton system. That's also very interesting. And I think this neural network phase diagram, very good agreement with previous estimates, which to a certain extent is very interesting and very curious. I would not be able to explain it to you why that is at this point. And just to end, it's not me who did all the work, that's all these guys did most of the work. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Questions for Maurice? Yuda.
Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. Very nice talk. But I have a question of someone completely outside of what you're explaining. What I want to know is, I mean, you have used a neural network type of system. which, I mean, for people like me, those are nodes and links. So the thing that I would like to know in your particular case, that is of this size, what are the, let's say, Hamiltonian potentials or equations that you use, let's say, for your nodes, and what are the links?
Yeah, okay, so basically these are kind of standard deep neural networks which use the standard sigmoidal activation functions. So what we do is, I have several snapshots from a DFT simulation. From that, I have the positions of all the atoms. I know what the forces are and all the virial and things like that. So this neural network, you give it the particle positions, and it will try to reproduce forces, the total energy, and the virial. So that's what this model does, this neural network. Okay.
And for that, for inferring the real system, what do you use?
So we could. So in this case, we have these two ice phases, which we consider at different temperatures. So we've got a couple of versions of the ice 18 at different temperatures, also ice 10. So we run simulations. We have several deformation states. In each of the deformation states, I have forces and positions and virial total energy. And for this collection, in total, I think we had something like 5,000 different configurations. And we use that to fit this neural network. And actually, like in this paper that we published in 22, we actually combine, or we compare, say, these deformation curves from DFT with the neural network, and we had very good agreement. But this, of course, is kind of different because we never put any phase transition or phase behavior in this model. Okay?
I have a quick question about the Martin-Cittick transformation when you go to the other ice phase down there.
Yeah.
What kind of boundary conditions do you have?
It's periodic boundary conditions.
Periodic
yes.
boundary conditions.
Yeah.
And when the transition happens, does the unit cell change a lot?
Oh yes,
Just a little
you could see it in the animation, right?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can bring this up again. It's not going. Let's see. So we can just perhaps run this. See?
Yeah. No, I'm just wondering whether if you constrain the size, the total strain of the system, whether you get some sort of a fine structure that would happen.
Well, I mean, certainly that's an interesting point.
And whether it's physically interesting from the point of view of applications or something like that.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that we look at, which people normally look at when you consider Martin-Cittick phase transformations, is you have a relationship between crystallographic planes before and after. So you've got, say, like a 1-1-1 plane, and the FCC becomes a 1-1-0. And so we actually looked at those orientational relationships, and they are what you see commonly in metals, for instance, right? But in this case, these are still small systems. It's periodic boundary conditions. So what we're doing now is actually we are looking at a polycrystal or with grain boundaries in it, and see what goes on if you do that, if you have this kind of system, which is closer to a real system with grains, basically, not a monocrystal. Right.
Thank you very much.
So here we were more interested in basically the thermodynamics of the thing, right?
Thank you. More questions? If not, let's thank Maurice again.
Right.
And all the speakers of this session. We'll have a coffee break, poster.
Ah. 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 Tá, esse é o usual, né? Tudo bem. Pensou se eu surf e entregas tudo melado pro próximo. Tá gravando isso ainda. Não, é que não tem ninguém. Isso é uma coisa que o Fiore faria, né?
Eu preciso começar a sessão. Fala com ele aqui, ó. Ele está nessa sala aqui, lá no final. Hi everyone, welcome back. So now we have the session of contributed talks, and we start with Masayuki Hase from the School of Art, Science and Humanities of the University of São Paulo. Thank you very much.
Okay, so first, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. And well, these are some of the people involved somehow in this project. Okay, but what I would like to start with some trivial issues. So first, this is a map of São Paulo City. Okay, so we can see streets, we can see avenues here. Maybe some of you can recognize this structure. Okay, but the point is, it's very clear that we can regard this as a network where streets are connections, and when streets meet each other, we have a node. Okay, so we have this network structure here, and we know by experience, unfortunately, that one of the problems in São Paulo is the traffic jam. Okay, so suppose that you are interested in planning a city from the scratch. So, of course, there are many, many issues, but today I'm going to focus on just one of them. And it's very clear that what we don't want here is a node with many, many connections. So if you are trying to monitor the evolution of a city, you have to pay attention not to connect so many links to a single node. Okay, so this is just a simple fact, okay, a trivial one. And there is another example here which follows the same problem, which is the power grid. And this time, we have the nodes are substations, there are transformers. And again, we don't want to link many, many connections to a single node to prevent overheating, which can cause failures, which can cause accidents. Okay, so we have something common between these two examples. Okay, so the idea is to monitor the evolution of the network and to pay attention not to link so many connections to a single node. And of course, the list of examples is huge. We can say the same thing about airports. Okay, so we don't want many flights landing in the same place at the same time. And of course, we can see these kind of problems in food chains, for instance. Okay? So if you try to modify the environment of somewhere, you don't want to introduce new species. You don't want to introduce new uniques to a single species because this can lead to some harmful consequence to the species we are looking at. Okay, so basically, from these 4 examples, of course, what I'm interested in is not exactly the specific examples here, but the common question that we can pose to all these examples is how long it takes for a vertex, which degree k naught, reach degree k for the first time. And the first time is because we don't want this to happen. Okay, the first time is a tragedy. Okay, so the way we are going to approach this problem is to map this problem into our classical random walk problem. So just to make clear what I'm talking about, I will spend 1 minute just explain what's the basic idea of this model. So suppose that we have a node with k naught connections, degree k naught, and suppose that by the dynamics of this network, it gains, let's say, four more connections. Okay? So if you look at this degree axis, we were here, okay? And then this node received 4 more connections, then it jumps here, okay? And suppose that then in the next time step, it gains 3 more connections. So from here, we jump to here, okay? And suppose that then, for some reason, this node loses 5 connections, then it goes back to this position, okay? So the random walk I'm talking about is not the random walk in the usual space, but the random walk in this degree space. Okay, so this is a one-dimensional random walk, and the problem of random walk is quite old. Okay, so we have to discuss what is old here. But the name itself was coined about 100 years ago by this gentleman, Carl Pearson. This is the Pearson father, one of the gentlemen who was responsible for the frequency school in statistics, together with Galton and Fisher. Okay, and actually he sent a letter to Nature asking about this 2-dimensional random walk. But here the length of the walk is constant, but the angle of each step is a random variable. Okay, and this letter was immediately answered by Lord Rayleigh. Okay, and he said that he has solved this problem about 30 years before. Okay, and then he gave this answer to this question. And to this answer, Carl Pearson sent a letter saying thank you and got a second publication in Nature. Okay, and this problem of random walk is a very familiar one with those who are working with statistical physics. And immediately people realized that we can work with random walks on regular lattices, like square lattices, cubic lattices, or lattices, hypercubic lattices, higher dimensions. And what we know from these models is that we can, of course, we can pose many questions. And one of them is if a walker, which starts at the origin, if it returns to the origin or not. So this is what we call recurrence probability. This is the probability that a walker starting from the origin, she or he returns to the origin if we wait long enough. Okay? And it happens with probability 1, so the random walk is recurrent for dimensions 1 and 2, for symmetric random walk. Okay? So by symmetric random walk, I mean the probability of going to one direction, to any direction available, is the same. Okay? And however, for dimensions equal or larger than 3, this is tangent, meaning that there is a non-zero probability that the particle escapes to the infinity, okay, or it doesn't return to the origin. Okay, and we also know that for symmetric random walk, when it returns to the origin, the time it requires scales with the size of the network. Okay, So these are some basic stuff that people know for many, many decades. Okay? And what we are going to do is to study the dynamics of our networks, or the degree dynamics, using this random walk approach. Okay, so it's a one-dimensional random walk, but it's not a symmetric one. So the dynamics is governed by the models that we are interested in. So I have chosen some of the most popular ones. Okay? And here, we are not going to talk about the recurrence probability. So of course, we could. But the idea here is, starting from degree k0, what's the probability of achieving another degree k? Of course, k can be k0. In this case, we recover the previous point. But the question here is more general. And so for this reason, we are calling this arrival probability, not returning probability. And if it returns, how long it takes to a vertex achieve degree k for the first time. Okay, so we're going to see these 4 models. Keep in mind these 2 questions in this talk. Okay, so the first one, okay, so I will start with these 2 models, the famous Erdős-Zsényi and Watt-Strogatz. And originally, they are static networks, but of course, there is a dynamics. We can introduce a natural dynamics to produce them. So basically, in Erdős-Zsényi network, we have a fixed number of nodes, and then we randomly insert connections. Okay, and on the other hand, in the Watt-Strogatz model, we introduce the scheme of rewiring. Okay, with a given and fixed probability. So in the second model, if we look at a given vertex, it can gain or lose connections with some given probability. Okay? So for these 2 models, what we have found is that the arrival probability is 1, meaning that that looking at a given vertex, the probability that it achieves some pre-established degree is always possible. Okay, and since it satisfies this property, we can look at the time it requires to go from degree k0 to k, and this time we can do this analytically. And of course, what these 2 formulas they'll tell us is that this time scales with the size of the system, okay, as in symmetric random walk. But in the first one, the time depends only on the difference between the degrees, okay, while in the second one, this model depends independently. Okay, so we need to specify both the initial vertex and the final vertex. Okay, and so so this is not so exciting because the scaling follows some, let's say, some trivial one, which is the scale of the scales with the size of the network. So let's look at different class of networks, which are, let's say some dynamical networks. I'm not going to details, but they don't have this time translational symmetry. And I'm going to show 2 of them. One of them is the random recursive tree, which is basically we start with some bunch of nodes, and then we introduce at each time step a new node, and this node links to a previous one with uniform probability. Okay, so maybe it's the simplest growing network. Okay, and here we have to pay attention because in the previous case, we are interested in scaling the time it requires to achieve a given degree with the size of the system, but the size of the system was fixed. Okay? But in this case, the size of the system grows with time. Okay? So the question here is not like, okay, so we have a network, and we are asking if we wait long enough, it achieves the desired degree. But in this case is, if we allow the network to grow up to some time n, is it sufficient to achieve this degree that we want? So in this case, of course, the arrival probability is not exactly 1. Okay, so there is a probability that this network fails to achieve the pre-established degree. Okay, but however, as you increase, if you wait, if you allow the network to grow for a sufficiently long time, it converges to 1. And for this simple model, the time also depends on the difference between the degrees only. And as you can see here, it doesn't scale with the size of the system, but it scales logarithmically. So this is not exactly a straight line, but it's a logarithmic one. Okay? And the other one, the Barabash-Albert model. So basically here, we introduce new vertices, and the new vertices, it links to the other ones, probability proportional to the connection it has. So this basically it's saying that popular vertex are more likely to receive connections than the not so popular ones. Okay? And for this model, the arrival probability, not surprisingly, is not exactly 1, but it converges to 1 if you wait if you allow the network to grow large enough. Okay? And for this case, the mean first passage time, so the time it requires to achieve this degree, it depends independently on the initial degree and final degree, not only on the difference, but there is another feature, which is the following. So this is not so the idea of the result is general, but of course, these results are dependent on the parameters of the model. But there is a region where this time scales with a power law of the size of the network. And there is, of course, an initial vertex where it goes logarithmically. But if the initial vertex is large enough, then it converges, it reaches the final degree as a constant. Okay, there's a correction here related to the finite size, to the size of the system. But basically, this one is when the time it requires to reach the final degree is it goes to a constant, while the others, it diverges logarithmically, the other one diverges with a power law. Okay, so I think it's okay with my time. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Actually, you still had 30 seconds, so if you want to conclude something.
I didn't.
So questions? So does...
See, there are some practical cases to look at from this, using this formalism. Let me tell you about 2 of them. One of them is the electric network, the connections in the country. We had problems a few months ago in the Northeast. Okay. Should be very interesting to look at a real problem, a real network like this, and see how maybe there are already people looking at those networks. I don't know, but you know,
okay.
It's from another point of view. The other suggestion is to look at the internet, the propagation of fake news and news. There are few people looking at this in the world. It fits into this kind of formalism. How does it fit? Okay,
okay, thank you.
So does this mean that my street here will never get jammed, or there is a probability that the street where I live will never get jammed?
Well, it's kind of different because São Paulo is already there. I'm talking about a situation where we built a city from the scratch. So this can
yeah, the time scale for São Paulo to change.
You can close some streets. Huh? You can close some streets.
We can close some streets.
Can go back.
Yes.
More questions? So let's think again.
Teste. Vocês estão me ouvindo? Ok.
Era para ter colocado primeiro. Quer trocar?
Yeah. That's okay. Okay.
Teoricamente é ao contrário.
Não tem tanto problema,
No? Okay.
Okay, so now we have Guilherme Costa talking about dynamic of frustrated Kuramoto oscillators with modular connections. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizer for accepting me presenting a part of my work here. I'm a postdoc here at ICTP, and I will present part of my work under the advisor of Professor Marcos Aguiar. Well, synchronization is a phenomenon that can be found on several nature cases, such as the most widely common in the fireflies flashing on the dark wood, but also can be man-made. For example, I can put some metronomes on supported by a mobile plate, and then they will synchronize their frequencies after some time. But we also have some, let's say, more complicated situations. For example, synchronization in collective motion of bacteria, or in neuronal spiking, in which the usual models needs to be extended in order to capture those interactions. And in particular, the case of neuronal spiking is interesting because there are recent evidence that some brain disorders are related to the abnormal synchronization in the brain, for example, the Alzheimer's disease. So it's interesting to investigate those kinds of phenomena in a tentative, trying to understand how those disorders came to be. Well, the paradigmatic model to investigate synchronization is the Kuramoto model, proposed in 1975, in which a population of oscillators described by those phases and having a natural frequency omega, they are coupled following this equation, a sinusoidal function and with a coupling strength k. And to investigate this system, we use this complex order parameter that the module, this module P, indicates if the system is synchronized or in a disordered motion. If the center of mass is small, we have all the oscillators rotating with the natural frequency, and then we have disordered motion. But if this coupling is strong enough, then all the system rotates with a given frequency. Several extensions and generalizations of this model were proposed in the recent years, and one interesting representation is the vectorial representation, in which I change the phase for a vector. So instead of consider a phase oscillating in time, I have a vector rotating in this case, on the unit circle, and I can describe this vector by those phases theta here. And by considering this vectorial representation, I can write a more general equation in which I can promote the coupling constant to a matrix K. So instead of a scalar constant, a scalar coupling, I have a matrix coupling, and I can parameterize this matrix by a rotation matrix plus a symmetrical one, described by these 4 parameters: K, alpha, J, and beta. Okay, and this generalization presents novel behaviors in terms of synchronizations. Here is the phase diagram of the system. In blue, we have the disordered region in which the system does not synchronize, but we have 2 new phases, 2 new synchronized phases. The phase tune, which is when the oscillators, they lock on a given direction, now on a direction given by the largest eigenvalue of the largest eigenvector of the matrix K. So we have a break in the rotational symmetry of the system. And we also have this oscillatory behavior in which the phase and the module of the order parameter oscillates in time, which is illustrated here on the right. So the oscillators, they shrink and they expand as they rotate on the circle. And those different regions are bounded by more simple models. The Kuramoto one is described by those diagonals in which the eigenvalues of the matrix are degenerate. And if I have j equals 0, I have Kuramoto-Sakaguchi models described by this horizontal line. Okay, so this model was studied in the context of all-to-all interactions and considering that all oscillators have the same matrix coupling. So we can extend this reasoning and ask a lot of questions. For example, what happens when I consider substrates like this? I have some modules that have, for example, different functions on the brain, and each one of these modules have a different coupling matrix, and I'm interested to see in which conditions they can maintain their individual dynamic, or in which conditions they synchronize all together. Okay, so here we have a real example of a real modular network. This is the Drosophila fly connectome. We can clearly see the existence of those two modules. And this will be the system that I will be working on in a more simple way. Because to perform some dimensionality reduction, we can use the Ott-Antonsen ansatz, which is valid under certain conditions. And we can, instead of work with n equations, I can reduce these equations to 4, in which describes the module P and phase C of each module. So instead of having dynamical equations for each oscillator, I can write equations for the order parameter itself. So we can reduce to these 4 equations. But these equations still are complex to analyze analytically. So we still need to perform numerical integrations in order to investigate how the dynamic of the system will behave. And because of this, we need to make some considerations. The first one is to consider that the interactions between the modules are equivalent to a usual Kuramoto. So within the modules, we have a coupling matrix that is more complex, but the interactions between the modules are more simple, are just as Kuramoto. We also can set these parameters better to 0 because it's a lesser parameter in the model. It does not define the dynamic. The dynamic is defined by k, j, and alpha. So we can set these parameters to 0 without loss of generality. And because we still have 7 parameters, we can, okay, in which combinations I will study? We set the module 1 as a Kuramoto-Sakaguchi, in which we only have k and alpha. And the other model, the module 2, with complementary parameters. So we have this module 1 with j. So we have an extreme case in which all other cases have some kind of we have this extreme case in order to investigate the most extreme situation possible. Okay. In addition, we also consider this strong synchronization on the uncoupled dynamic, which means that when this parameter is 0, we are interested in that each individual module have a higher degree of synchronization. Okay? So we performed some numerical integrations. We constructed the heat maps in the alpha KO into space, in which for all diagrams, we have the time average order parameter, P, and you can see some interesting behaviors here. For example, this first is for the module 1, this is for the module 2, and this is for the whole system. You can observe that something's happening as I traverse this curve, which is the usual Kuramoto-Sakaguchi transition. As I increase alpha in the Kuramoto-Sakaguchi, I observe a loss of synchronization, which is corresponding to this line. In the second module, we observe that something happens as I traverse this line, but with this metric, it's not possible to understand what's happening. But what draws our attention is this region. We have an asynchronous region that arises as the interaction between the modules are within some certain sort of parameters. For example, near K2 equals 6 and alpha equals 1.8. So we have modules that are initially synchronized. When I connect them, they lost their synchronization and created an asynchronous region. Well, we also calculated the detuning between the modules, which is the difference of the instantaneous frequencies and try to elucidate what's happening in each of those regions. We can clearly see now that we have more clear delimitation of those regions. We can see that this region 1 in orange, this region 2 in black, this brownish region in 3, and I also marked this point in 4, which corresponds to these asynchronous regions. Okay. So to understand what's happening here, we have some examples of trajectories of the order parameter in each one of these regions. You can see that when the detuning is large, implying that each module has their own dynamic. So you can see in this figure that the module 1, which is the blue, maintains the rotation. The module 2, which is the phase-tuned one, apart from small perturbations, they maintain locked in this, and the whole dynamic appears as this green circle. So within this region, their modules maintain their dynamic. In the region 2, which the tuning is 0, we can see that all modules are now in the phase-tuned state. So the dynamic is dominated by the module 2. In the region 3, we see that all modules oscillate, implying that the dynamics is dominated by module 1. Okay? And we also have this example of these asynchronous regions. We see that all modules spiral into 0 as the time passes. Okay? We also, now that we understand the dynamics of the system, we can, for example, vary one of the parameters and see what happens. By varying J, we observe that the asynchronous region, it shrinks, because here is J equals 6, J equals 5, equals half, and equals 0. You can see that the smaller J, the larger this region. In this case, J is equals 0 is really interesting because it's the one that we can calculate analytically. We can calculate this boundary analytically, which is this red line here. Okay, to support these results, we also performed some simulations, because one of the hypotheses on the Antonsen ansatz is that the oscillators have Lorentzian frequencies. So it's not clear that for the most used frequency, which is Gaussian, those results will still be valid. So we can see that in this case, when we have all connections with n equal 10,000 distributed, in which the natural frequencies are Gaussian distribution, we can observe qualitatively the appearance of this asynchronous region, which is the main result of this work. And by performing simulation on random partitions, which are networks divided into 2 groups, and I have a certain number of connections within the group and outside of the group. In this first one is when the modules, they are densely connected amongst them, and then I'll make the modules, I will removing connection between the modules, because in this case here we have the modules almost independent with a small fraction of connection between them. You can observe that in this case we also have the appearance of this asynchronous region, which was what interest us was. But as the number of connections between the modules become small, this region expands to a large portion of the simulation of the phase parameters until they eventually disappear here. Okay, so to conclude, we studied the system and concluded that they have a rich and complex dynamics with the existence of these 4 regions in which these modules are independent, a global phase-tuned, in which the module phase-tuned dominates, global oscillations, and the asynchronous regions. And this asynchronous region, which is the most, let's say, the most weird case, it changes and even vanishes if J is large enough, and those similar dynamics were obtained for simulations on complete and random partition graphs. That's all. Thank you.
So I have a question myself. If you have swarm relators that like to clusterize,
okay,
then you would, in principle, have the same physics of modularity arising, right? Because the clusters themselves would be the modules. So is this something that has been seen before for formulators that like to clusterize? Because I know that they have been studied to some extent, right?
Yeah, I don't know that much on formulator, but I believe that it can be made. When you have, for example, MIPS, when they have the formation of large clusters, you can have those kinds of substrates from the study of the oscillators themselves. Because the collective motion of bacteria usually is just spatial. You don't have an internal phase. You need to put this internal phase at hand after the formation of the clusters, I believe.
Yeah, and probably the kind of modularity would be different because you have a dynamic modularity for the clusters.
Yeah,
whereas here it's fixed.
I believe it would be really complex to analyze those kind, but really interesting to perform some simulations.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Is your model, is your version for the Kuramoto model, does it reproduce something like that explosive synchronization?
Yeah, just a note, it's not my model, but it's a model that was proposed by Professor Marcos Aguiar. But the explosive synchronization in this model occurs on odd dimensions, 3 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 7 dimensions. There is a general result that the Kuramoto on all dimensions is odd. Yeah, on all dimensions is explosive, and on even dimensions is continuous.
Is it only 1 dimension, or not in all?
Okay. It all depends on the dimension of the unit sphere that the angles are rotation. So since it's a circle, it's a 2-dimensional sphere.
Okay.
So in a 2-dimensional sphere is continuous, in a 3-dimension is explosive. In
okay.
4 dimensions, it became continuous again.
Additional questions?
I have one quick question. If you can move to the next slide, maybe.
Yes?
Yeah. That's an ansatz, right? We start with a model for any oscillators, I don't know, or something like that. And this is a simplifying assumption that these equations hold.
Yes.
For, I don't know, the modulus in the phase or something like that.
Yeah, the hypothesis made on the Altantos and ansatz is they prove that if you start the simulations on a certain subset on a torus of initial conditions, then the time evolving of these torus are solution of the Kuramoto equations.
They prove this for a particular case. Okay.
Yeah, and
okay,
because to obtain these equations, you need to perform some assumptions on the distribution of natural frequency, because you have an integral that can only be solved for Lorentzian distributions,
okay,
or delta distributions, which is not that interesting.
No, okay. I just want to make clear that I understood what. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's think again.
Okay.
Okay, so now we have André Timpanaro from UFABC talking about social fragmentation in an adaptive Volter model.
Okay, so, well, I'll be talking about social fragmentation, so I think I should start by explaining what I mean by that. So consider the following situation here on the left, where we have some network representing people interacting with each other. Here, each node is a different person, each connection is a different interaction, and here the different colors represent different opinions regarding some controversial subject, for example. So initially, the blue and red people are mixed in, so we have a lot of connections between blue, a lot of connections between red. But after a while, we arrive at a situation where these two factions have formed communities split with very few connections between them. And this is the type of thing that I'm calling social fragmentation. And there are some experimental results showing that you can see this type of things happening in social networks. This leads to things that we call echo chambers and filter bubbles. And the idea of this work is using modeling to try to understand the origins of this type of behavior. Now, for that, I'm going to be using some modified versions of the Volter model. The Volter model uses the exact same paradigm of my example. Here, society is a network where each person is a node or site, each edge is a social connection, and we attribute to each node an opinion, which will be 1 out of m abstract values. Now, the dynamics of the usual Volter model are pretty simple. It's just pretty much choose a site at random, choose a neighbor of the site, also at random, and then the node copies the opinion of the site. So you're pretty much just copying what your neighbors are doing. Now, in order to see social fragmentation, we need to add some kind of mechanism for the network to change with time. And what I did here was adding 2 different ingredients. First, I add some thing that you can interpret as a noise, which is the possibility that a site changes its opinion randomly, which will happen with a probability Pn, and the possibility that if 2 neighbors have different opinions, then they rewire their connections to sites that they agree with, which will happen with probability PR. So this is our mechanism for changing the network. Now, this rewiring can be happening in 2 different ways. The first one, which I call active rewires, is when the rewire happens when the sites interact with each other. So in this case, a time step would look something like that. We choose a site at random, for example here, F. Now the first thing that we check is whether or not F will be affected by the noise. So with probability Pn, F changes its opinion, and that's the end of our time step. Otherwise, with probability 1 minus Pn, F is not affected by the noise, and we keep following the script of the Volter model. We choose a neighbor at random, in this case, D. Now, 2 things can happen. We can, with probability 1 minus PR, do the Volter model update, and now F copies the opinion of D. Or, with probability PR, since F and D disagree, F can rewire one of its connections to D to a site that it agrees with. In this case, it rewired from D to E. The second type of rewire that we can use is what I call a reactive rewire. In this case, rewires happen whenever a site changes its opinion. Then its neighbors might decide to rewire their connection to it. We start the same way. We choose a site at random, and once again, we check whether or not F is affected by the noise. With probability Pn, it's affected by the noise and changes its opinion. But now, since F changed its opinion, now A and B do not agree with F. So for each of the connections that they have with F, they will attempt to rewire these connections, and each of these attempts will be successful with probability PR. So not all connections will be rewired. You still have to throw a coin to decide that. Otherwise, F is not affected by the noise, so with probability 1 minus Pn, we do the Volter model update. We choose a neighbor, and F copies the opinion of this neighbor. Once again, this changes the opinion of F. A and B no longer agree with F, and they will attempt to rewire their connections to F. Now, in these types of voter and more generally opinion propagation models, the network topology is very important. This is not really the case in this model because since the dynamics is changing the network, after a while, the dynamics will lead to an emergent geometry of the network, and whatever was your starting geometry will be completely destroyed. The only information you'll be left with is the number of sites and the average coordination. There's some evidence of this. Here in red, we have simulations for active rewires. In blue, you have simulations for reactive rewires. You can see we have two curves. One of these, I started with a square lattice, and the other one, I started with a Barabasi-Albert network. After a while, they have the same degree distribution. And another thing that's interesting in the case of active rewires is that the degree distribution is pretty much the degree distribution of a Edus-Renyi network. So it's pretty much a random network. But we still keep some correlations in the reactive case. Here are some examples of the networks after the transient. Here on the left, on the top, we have a situation without any noise. And if you don't have any noise, then just the rewiring mechanism will separate the different opinions into components. Here we had 4 opinions. We ended up in 4 components. And this example is also nice because it has an example of a problem that we will have later on. You can see that the purplish blob there has only one opinion, but the algorithm I'm using to detect communities has found 3 different communities there. This is completely an artifact of the algorithm. Sometimes if you just run it again, it will find just one single community there. So we need to deal with this during our analysis. On the top right is an example of a situation where you didn't get social fragmentation. Here you have 8 opinions, but the 8 opinions are still very well mixed, even after the transients. On the bottom is a representative case of what happens when you have social fragmentation, but you have noise, so this prevents the separation of the components. On the left, we have 4 opinions, and we can see here 4 main communities. On the right, we have 8 opinions, and we can see 8 main communities. Okay, so how we detect these communities besides just checking visually the graphs, which is not feasible. What I did was study this quantity here, and the gist of this quantity is that if you calculate this in a community, it will range from 1 divided by m for a situation where the community is completely mixed, completely homogeneous, all the way to 1 to a situation where the community holds only 1 opinion. And then you just average this whole thing for the whole network to get around that misidentification that I showed earlier. The trick is to just make this a weighted average using the size of the community as your weight. The rationale is that if you have just one big community and you calculate Q, and later you split this community and try to do this weighted average, you get pretty much the same result using this weighted average. Now, what I'm going to do here for the analysis is I'm going to check whether Q is large or small. If Q is large, the detection I'm doing does not use any opinion information. So if Q is large, then the detection that's coming just from the geometry is matching exactly the way that opinions are divided. So the communities that are being seen are actually the result of social fragmentation. If Q is small, then either the communities are spurious or the algorithm just picked up one single community. So there's no social fragmentation in this case. Here we have the results for the simulations. Here, the x-axis is the strength of the rewiring. The y-axis is the strength of the noise. The top row is 2 opinions, the bottom row is 4 opinions, and the different columns are different values of the coordination of my network. And you can see here that there's very little dependency with the number of opinions, and there's a little dependency with the coordination, but mostly have a qualitative behavior where if you increase the rewiring strength, you get more fragmentation. If you increase the noise, you get less fragmentation. But one thing that's interesting is that you need very large values of the probability of rewiring to actually see some fragmentation. You need something like 60%, 70% in the case of active rewires, and you need a little less in reactive case. You just need some 40, 50%. But you still get pretty much the same qualitative behavior. Now, another thing that I did was kind of mean field treatment. And the idea here is that you don't want to throw away your network information in this mean field treatment. So the idea is, I'm going to assume that all the opinions have more or less the same number of sites holding them, which is a reasonable assumption in the voter model because of the noise. The noise drives naturally the model to this situation. And I'm going to assume that all the sites have a neighborhood that is representative of the whole network. So I'm going to characterize the whole network by some parameter P-same, which is the probability that two neighbors have the same opinion. The idea is to just do these symmetry assumptions, do one time step, and see how P-same changes. It's a hell of a calculation, but in the end, you can translate this into an ODE. You can study the attractors of this ODE, and then you can compare with the P-same that you extract from your simulations. Here I have a comparison between the mean field and the simulations. Here on the top, we have the mean field simulations for two opinions, all for 3, 5, and 7, average coordination. On the bottom, I have simulations here for the active rewire case. And you can see that's pretty much very similar. You can capture at least the qualitative behavior. If you try the reactive case, you get a bit larger discrepancy, especially for low noise. I think this has to do with the emergent geometry. In the case of an active rewire, it's pretty much a random network, which fits better the approximation of the mean field, whereas you still have correlations for reactive rewires. Okay, so that was pretty much everything I had to talk here. Just to wrap everything up, we can see a transition between a situation with no social fragmentation and the appearance of social fragmentation. From the point of view of interpretation and trying to compare this with things that happen in the real world, I think that the values of the probability of rewiring are a bit too unrealistically high. I mean, I don't think you block someone with 80% probability just because you slightly disagree with them. This seems a bit excessive. But maybe that's just an artifact of the voter model. Maybe changing the model would reduce this value. It's something that I still need to study. The number of opinions does not seem very important, which was a bit surprising for me. Active rewires have a better match with the mean field, which I think has something to do with the topology. And what I'm planning to do from here is I'm going to try to look at a different model, because the voter model is kind of neutral in a sense that if you add just a little bit of noise, it goes to a situation where all the opinions have the same number of people. If you go to something like the Schneider model that has a much stronger tendency towards consensus, this is not the case. I think it would be interesting to see what happens when you make this change. Well, that was all I had. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to come here, and thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much. So essentially, you have explained the main social phenomenon that happened in Brazil in the last years.
Oh yeah, yes. It's what inspired me to start looking at this.
So, questions?
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your talk. I mean, you explained the case of Brazil. Can you explain the case of Milei in Argentina, who won so differently? I mean, it was not an election, it was 48-52 like it was here. There was, I mean...
I think that was a bit of a bit of protest voting mixed in.
Yeah,
in there.
I mean, we can explain the psychology behind that thing. I'm trying to say, what would you need to put into your system to come out with results like that?
One that is not this model. It's another one I thought about some years ago. It's the idea that you can hold an opinion, but you can have some satisfaction towards your opinion. So that is, you start with your opinion and you're satisfied with it, and then something happens that makes you unsatisfied, and now you're prone to change your opinion. But then you also need to introduce some kind of motivations. I mean, why would you change your opinion? I think in the case of Argentina is a point that no one was satisfied. People weren't seeing, I think, any alternatives, and then this guy comes out of nowhere. This guy is at least new, and that. So I don't have a pre-established opinion about them, even though he sounds like a madman, which, in my opinion, is what happened with Bolsonaro also some years ago here.
Yeah, the difference is that here in Brazil, Lula was known, right? I mean, for this last election.
Yes, for this last one. So the people had some expectation of what would happen. Yes.
Hi, thanks for the nice presentation. My question regards even in your model, you talked about the voter model and then about the Snage model, which are the opinions are discrete.
Yes.
Have you thought on studying continuous dynamic opinion? Or
there is a paper that studies this kind of things in the DEF1 model, which is a continuous opinion model. The results that you get is that in the DEF1 model, it is basically the same. You have the general basic paradigm, and the idea is that when you try to interact with someone, you have some real number that is your opinion, they have a real number. If the distance is too much, then we just don't interact. Otherwise, we move both our opinions closer to a compromise. What happens in this case, if you try to add this, would be if our opinions are distant, this would be a disagreement, and we might try to rewire our connections to someone that's closer to us. What you end up having is the situation, the network fragments, they weren't adding noise. Probably if you add noise, you get something that's a little bit different. But the network fragments into components, and each component has a number, and if you plot the distribution, have peaks. Each peak corresponding to one of the different components. So if you make the distance required to interact smaller, then you end up with more components. If you make it larger, you end up with fewer components. That's more or less the thing you have.
Great, so let's think again. So yeah, I'm enjoying quite a lot the diversity of topics here today.
It's what you get with complex systems.
Yes, if you call it complex systems, that's what. Yeah. So now, last but not least, we have Carlos Fiore. Isso aqui é para a câmera lhe seguir. Aí você bota no bolso. Okay, so now we have Carlos Fiore talking about general features of collective engines. Thank you.
Thanks, Pablo and Danilo, for the opportunity. Now, I've been some time ago discussed about collective systems. Now I will discuss another aspect about collective engine. More specifically, I will discuss the role of the topology the topology of interactions. Okay, start. This is a typical problem question in thermodynamics. I have a setup. It receives a given amount of heat from the hot air reservoir. It converts partially in work or power, and one part is rejected to the cold bath. Okay, this you can ask, in the last years, you have asked the same questions, but now for the standard macroscopic thermodynamics, but for the thermodynamics of small systems, this has given rise to the stochastic thermodynamics operating in the context of non-equilibrium systems, and you can also make the same questions: efficiency, power, optimization. But now, there are three remarkable differences when you are interested in these properties. In contrast to the standard thermodynamics, the thermodynamics we learned from the undergraduate course, here the work source, the work is not obtained by moving pistons. Now, the energy conversion comes from currents of macroscopic particles. Second difference, typically these systems operate far from the equilibrium, and consequently its performance is expected to be lower than the ideal de Carnot efficiency. Now, third difference, fluctuations of quantities and currents can be important in this case, okay? And the search of the strategy can be crucial. Okay, I will give two examples of typically setups used in the context of non-equilibrium system. The most common is this. You have a two-level system, for example, a quantum dot or something like that. It's placed in contact with two reservoirs, one hot and cold, and you can place in contact simultaneously or sequentially. And there is some current fluxes, heat fluxes, and convert of heat into work, and this is the typical setup. However, in the last years, some people, including me, we are interested in setups composed of interacting systems, because nature is a plenty of complex system. In particular, how the phase transition can influence in the performance of the system. This is completely different from this case. In this talk, I will address these questions, but I will explain the role of the topology of interactions, okay? You can find more details in the recent published paper. And I will consider a simple setup composed of n particles. Each particles can be individually in two levels. One fundamental level and a lower level, and other upper level of energy epsilon. The total energy due to the total energy is this term contributes to this. If you have n particles in the upper level, this is the total contribution to the energy, okay? Okay, the interaction in this case, I follow these recipes, and the interaction is among units, particles which are in distinct energy levels. In other words, one particle in the upper level interact with other particles in the lower level, and the vice versa. Of course, you can map this in another, if you are interested in describing particles with interaction when they are in the same upper level, it's only to rescale this. And in this case, the most general case is the following. The interaction is one particle and its ki nearest neighbors, okay? In this talk, I will exploit distinct topologies of interactions. For example, in a square lattice, k is equal to 4. In the all-to-all, I mean, all particles in this level, in the upper level, interact with the rest of particles in the lower level, this is replaced to M, okay? And another topology, maybe, I don't know if it's closely related to the Kuramoto, but you have some works in the Kuramoto model. In this topology, the star graph, we have something like that, a central site with interaction with these leaves. But the hub interacts with leaves, but its leaf only interacts with the hub. Okay? In this talk, I will exploit these distinct topologies in order to address the question, is the topology is important? How its relationship with the model parameters, okay? This is the central question I would like to answer, okay? Okay, this system, I use the typical setup from non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, Markovian system described by a master equation. This is this sum accounts to the thermal reservoir, to the two thermal baths, here's to the configurations, and I use this choice of transition rates, okay? And this is the interaction, this is in the interaction. This term is not so important, but I use the following, the original model is some activation energy. You can interpret it as the coupling between the unit and the reservoir is different, okay? And here is the work source. It comes from a non-conservative forces. In other words, transitions from this state to this is favored by the driving when it's placed in contact with the cold thermal bath. And this transition from the up state to the low state when it placed in contact with the hot bath. Of course, you can consider a distinct another work source, but this is one of the simplest. And okay, this is our setup. So the goal is to study the topology and the interaction. This is our model. This is our setup. This is the framework. Now I will show you the first law and the second law of thermodynamics in this stochastic approach, okay? You can consider start the part from this energy mean, and you can take the time derivative, and by inserting into the master equation, you can split this in three parts. This part accounts to the work or power. It comes from the non-conservative force, and this is the flux, as I told you in the beginning of this talk, okay? It does not come from moving pistons, but instead of stochastic currents, okay? This is the heat. The heat exchanged with the new cold bath, okay? And this is for the all-to-all interactions is this. Of course, the all-to-all and the star graph models are interesting, not because they are opposite versions in some sense, because one represents everyone interacting with everyone. The other version is the opposite, is a minimal interaction structure, but also because they can be exactly solvable, okay? But in the last slide, I will show some results beyond these minimal models, okay? But in principle, if you for these exactly models, you can find the non-equilibrium distribution by solving this master equation, and you find in this master equation, you can find expressions for power and heats, and you have the first law of thermodynamics as should it be. The second law of thermodynamics can be formulated in terms of this definition of entropy production, okay? Entropy production is a key quantity to quantify the degree of the reversibility, because when your system evolves to equilibrium steady state regime, here is the detailed balance, and it gives a zero entropy production. Otherwise, when when he is lacking a parenthesis, and when the tailed balance is violated, this entropy is strictly positive, okay? So the entropy production discern equilibrium from the non-equilibrium. And in this case, in the non-equilibrium, by inserting that the transition rates, you can writing down the entropy production in a form akin to the relationship between heat and the entropy in equilibrium systems. Okay, this is the form. Okay, of course, this quantity should be strictly positive in the non-equilibrium state regime we are studying. Okay, I formulated the first law and the second law. Of course, if you are interested in studying the system performance, you have the definition of efficiency, which is the ratio between the power and the heat extracted from the hot reservoir. If this quantity is constrained between 0 and the Carnot, the system operates as a heat engine. This is the largest and partially converted into power. But you can also have something like that, a refrigerator. The power is largest, used to deliver, to extract heat from the cold to the hot. Okay, so the system can also operate as a pump, as I am going to show you. But by using the same definition of efficiency, you have this regime for the pump. Of course, it's not violation, okay? It's only I used this definition for that. Of course, the system cannot operate as an engine. It can be that, okay? The efficiency is negative. My goal here is to study these parameters and how the topology, how they influence the topology. Okay? In the first graph, I consider for a small individual energy, I compare the star all-to-all interactions, all system interacted to everyone, and here the star graph. And here, in this case, the topology is important, because here you have the heat engine regime. Here you have a discontinuous phase transition. It operates doodly, but you see the behavior is very different. Okay, the system performance is different in these cases. So, for small individual energies, the topology is important. This is reinforced by analyzing here in a Barabasi-Albert structure. Here, for some mean connectivities, the system does not exhibit a heat engine behavior. By increasing the mean connectivity, it approaches to the all-to-all. Okay? An opposite scenario is when the individual energy is larger. We see all results for the distinct topology are practically the same. So this highlights us for larger individual energies, you don't have the phase transition. The phase transition is absent here. The density approaches to 0. Whereas here it approaches to 1 for the all-to-all. And here the topology is not important. In this case, it is important. And the last slide, I compare all structures, Barabasi-Albert, homogeneous structure, all-to-all, and the star graph. And you see, apart from small differences, as the interaction is changed, here results are practically the same. And here the power are practically the same. So for larger energies, the topology is not important in this present model. On the other hand, when the small individual energies, when individual energies are smaller, the role of topology is important. Okay, this is how I would like to show you. And thanks again for the invite. You survived to the last talk.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I have a first you.
Two questions. The first one, did you try to study what happens with the fluctuations? Because I think you could relate those kind of things with TORs, for example. You have the the power output, you have the efficiency. If you had the fluctuations, I think.
That's a good question. I have not studied yet the fluctuations in these models. Fluctuations, for example, but it can be evaluated. No, I have not studied, but I would like to understand, but I have not studied probably because I don't know if it's directly to relate this with the fluctuations, but fluctuations is important in this class of systems, okay?
The other one is, do you think you could solve the ring too?
Sorry?
Do you think you could solve also a ring topology?
No, I have not studied. No. That's a good, also, this might be a good approach. I mean, sorry, I forgot the word. It might be a nice structure for studying. No, I have not studied. When I consider the star graph, I consider it because I would like to compare opposite structures, but in some sense, this is something like that opposite, okay?
So your system is spatially homogeneous, right? Because both baths are touching the whole system in a way. Or you have boundaries.
In some, all units are placed simultaneously placed in contact with both baths.
Yeah, because if you have like spatially heterogeneity, for instance, parts of the system have different configurations from certain other parts.
But you mean one part of the system is placed in contact with the hot and the other part with the cold? Is this what you mean?
That's one possibility. But in any situation where you have a spatial heterogeneous state, like phase-separated state, like a region with certain order parameter and a region with another order parameter, then you could have what people are calling entropy production field, where you have spatially different entropy production situations, right? So this might also help you understand what's the role of entropy production, because you will see certain states have a more entropy production than others.
Yes, you can discuss later. Yes, there are several open questions. For example, if you consider an heterogeneous lattice, and consider distinct drivings over distinct distinct neighborhoods, for example. And a question which arises is, if you want your system operate as an engineer, does it suffice to put work source in some most connected, for example?
I see.
But I don't know.
Nice
I don't
question,
have answer for these questions.
Great. So more questions? Ok, so thanks again.
Obrigado, vocês sobreviveram aí o último.
Agora a gente pode voltar a falar português. Obrigado todo mundo.